Welcome to the 2021 virtual forecast. Remember that Big Eye Oregon has your back. Today's program is a fundraiser for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. So far, you have helped us raise quite a bit of money for Make-A-Wish Oregon. To date, the Big Eye Next Gen has raised $14,707 through their Wish Ball, the Silent Auction Gala, and the Ugly Sweater virtual party. The virtual forecast registration so far has generated over $1,200. You can continue to make contributions if you would like by texting Big Eye or to 44321. Again, text Big Eye or to 44321 if you'd like to make a contribution to Make-A-Wish Foundation. Let's hear a little bit from Make-A-Wish.
Hello, Big Eye Oregon. It's Mallory here from Make-A-Wish. Thank you so much for fundraising for us. Once again, we are so appreciative. It's been a really challenging year for us, but we are granting wishes and Wish Kids are still wishing for wishes. We've done some amazing wishes just this past month. Shopping spree wishes, backyard play structures, hot tubs, room redos, you name it, we're doing it.
Hi, my name is Sonali. I wish to have a pony because I want to feed ponies carrots.
Do you remember the day that he came home to your house and everybody was outside and he was there?
I liked it so much. All of the people at our house. So the fact that it made me a sign that said Penelope. I like to hug Cappy. Maybe I don't really kiss him because I bet his hair would get in my mouth. I ride Cappy down the road. When he stops, I pet him. And then it makes me feel like feeding him carrots again. Usually I don't really talk to him because I don't really speak horse like him. But I can just go, nay, nay. He's very funny and very sweet. Thank you for making my wish come true.
I hope you enjoyed watching Penelope's wish story. She is such a cutie pie. A wish brings hope, strength, and joy to so many children battling critical illnesses. And it's only because of donations from people like you that we're able to fulfill this critical life-changing mission for these kiddos. So please, again, thank you so much for this opportunity and thank you for what you're doing for all the kids here in Oregon and Southwest Washington. We really appreciate it. Have a great virtual forecast.
Thank you, Mallory from Make-A-Wish. We are very grateful for our 2021 Premier Partners. We're stronger together and we couldn't do it without you. We'd like to offer a special thanks to our Diamond Plus sponsor, our partners, Liberty Mutual and Safeco Insurance. We'd also like to thank our Diamond Partner Plus members, BBSI. Our Platinum partners are Imperial PFS and Kennedy Restoration. We'd also like to thank our gold sponsors, our silver sponsors, and last but not least, our bronze Premier Partners. Thank you again to all of our Premier Partners. In addition to thanking our Premier Partners today, we would be remiss to not acknowledge a significant milestone for the Big Eye of Oregon. Last week marked the 28th anniversary of our Executive Director, Tira Dressel, serving the Big Eye of Oregon. She has the youth and energy of a 20-something, and yet the experience of someone twice her age. Please join me in congratulating and thanking Tira for her 28 years of dedicated service and leadership. Feel free to flood her email and voicemail with accolades because we all know between running our association, a virtual triple threat, raising a family during COVID, she's got nothing but time on her hands. In all seriousness, thank you, Tira. We all love and appreciate you and the work you do on our behalf. And now, on with the main event. Last year, we were threatened by snow, ice, and hail. Then came our Black Swan event, a pandemic. Today, power failures and access to Wi-Fi computers cause equal challenges, but nothing can keep us from John Mitchell. In fact, John Mitchell is joining us from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho today, where he's joining us from a phone with no power in his house. He's also trapped in his house because his garage door won't open. So we are really appreciative, and we're hoping that you'll give us a little bit of slack as we try to do this entirely virtually. John has been sharing his insights and forecasts with the Big Eye of Oregon longer than many of you have been in the insurance industry. For those who don't know John, he received his BA degree from Williams College and his MS and PhD degrees from the University of Oregon. He's a fellow of the College of Arts and Science of the University of Oregon and a member of Phi Beta Kappa. John was a professor of economics at Boise State University for 13 years before joining U.S. Bancorp in July of 1983. He was a chief economist of U.S. Bancorp until July of 1998 and served as the economist Western Region for the U.S. Bank until July of 2007. He wrote U.S. Bancorp's regional publications, including The Update, The Business Barometer, Northwest Portrait, and U.S. Territories, and was a columnist for the Oregon Business Magazine. He also wrote Sterling Bank's economic newsletter from 2007 to 2012. He currently speaks to conventions and business groups around the nation. He was a business analyst for KPTV in Portland, and he's been making economic presentations on the nation and the region for more than 50 years. John and his wife, Carol, live in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where they have no power today. But when they do have power and get out and don't do economic forecast, John enjoys spending time with their granddaughters. And now, without any further ado, please welcome the man, the myth, the legend, the incomparable, and the unstoppable, Mr. John Mitchell. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve. When that power went out this morning, I panicked, and I've never done one of these on the phone, just on the phone before. So this will be an interesting experience. You know, if you think about a little more than a year ago, on the other side of the world, a virus moved from a bat to a human, and it impacted us in profound ways. I've entitled this "The Pandemic, the Response, and the Restructuring." One of the fascinating, all right, next slide. One of the fascinating accounts of this, a book called Apollo's Arrow, written by an epidemiologist, and it had this wonderful sentence: an invisible force that pushes us physically apart. I mean, that's what the virus has done. It's not something that's new in human history, but it's new on this scale to us in this generation. You know, and we're living in a state that I'll show you in a minute is no longer near the top of the pack. It's very different than the situation we were in recent years. We've been through a very sharp, deep contraction that was not caused by a breakdown in the financial system or something like that. It was an exogenous shock of the virus, and then a response, a policy response that shut activity down. It's been a regressive downturn in the sense that it has hit disproportionately low-income people. There was a late year slowing in 2020. We have witnessed massive policy efforts that continue, both monetary policy and fiscal policy. I'll talk more about that later. And the US, the Census Bureau estimates, we finished the year with the lowest population growth rate in the United States since 1900. Okay, and of course we're now embarking on the process of vaccinating most people on the planet. You think about from an insurance perspective, for a long time there was less driving. Of course, in the Northwest, we've had way more fires, and negligible interest rates, always a problem from the standpoint of portfolio management. And then, of course, there was the disturbing images from last week. All right, next slide, please. Now, as every year when I present to this group, I love to use this slide. It changes every month. It comes out from Arizona State, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They rank states by annual employment growth. Now, this doesn't look anything like what we've seen in the past. Notice Oregon down there in bright red at number 32. If you remember the last few years, you know, Oregon, Washington, Idaho have tended to be in the top tier, in the top 10, our part of the world. Right now, okay, you can see we're down in the middle of the pack. 49 states are not up on a year-over-year basis. 49 states have employment lower than they had a year ago. The only state with employment growth at the moment is Idaho. If you look at this list, look at number 50, Hawaii. Well, if you think about it, there's no great surprise there with the dramatic importance of tourist and recreation activity there. You can see that's at in the weakest economy in the country. Okay, next one. Now, just a quick view of what's happened. On the left-hand side, we have the monthly changes in payroll employment. On the right side is real GDP growth. You can see those incredible declines, first in March, then in April, a huge decline in employment, monthly changes in payroll employment. Then it started up. And you can see between May and November, every single month was up. Then it dropped by 140,000 in December. On the right-hand side, you see the GDP growth rates. You see the decline at a 5% annual rate in the first quarter. Then in the second quarter, it went down at a 31.4% rate. The third quarter, it went up at a 33.4% rate. But you get the impression of the volatility that we have seen. Next slide. I like to use this to impress upon you the magnitude of what happened between March and April. You remember this is when we put in place the lockdowns, the stay-at-home orders. Employment declined, okay, by in essence 21,000 jobs in the month. That is a decade's worth of job growth that disappeared in the course of 1 month. Okay, you can see, if you look at this, every sector was down. Leisure and hospitality accounted for about a third of that drop. Okay, next slide. Then, now it doesn't show up very well because the number is relatively small when it has to have a scale that encompasses the 21 million. But in December, you saw the headlines last Friday, okay, that employment, that job count declined by 140,000 jobs. Sometimes the media said employers cut 140,000 jobs. Well, that's really not true, as I'll try to show you. The unemployment rate remained at 6.7. The over the month change was a minus 140,000. But if you go in behind some of the detail, it's sort of interesting. Leisure and hospitality lost about 500,000 jobs last month. But you'll remember, and you've seen on the national news, with more closures, you've seen it in Oregon, in California, more closures and cutbacks, restrictions on restaurants, big decline in leisure and hospitality. Government was down. You've seen weaknesses in portions of government education, higher education, and some support activities at the, in local education. Educational services was down, but couriers, messengers, warehouse employment was up by 45,000. Healthcare employment up by 38.8. Retail rose sharply. There's a lot of stuff going on behind that number that one number that you see talked about in the headlines. Average hourly earnings up 5% over the year. You saw a pickup there because you saw, for example, the weakness in low-wage employment, which pushes up average hourly earnings. There's a lot of slack out there. Okay, the BLS estimates about 15.8 million people had reported they had been unable to work because their employer closed or lost business due to the pandemic. They may be working part-time when they want to go full-time, and then 7.3 million people were out of the labor force, not looking for a job, but they want one. So there's slack out there at the moment. Okay, next slide. Just to show you the GDP fluctuations, so you can understand where that's coming from. These are the quarterly contributions to the GDP growth by sector. And what I want you to see is in the second quarter of this year, the big negative over on the left on consumption, consumer spending plummeted, and that's what pulled down the growth rate. Then you see in the third quarter, it shot back up and accounted for the vast bulk of the increase in the growth rate. And then if you look across, you can see equipment spending in the third category bounced up in the third quarter. Housing bounced up in the third quarter. Exports rose. Okay, imports subtracted, which means imports went up. So that subtracts from GDP, and you can see the inventory accumulation. But the key point, the key takeaway from this is the fluctuations from the consumption side, and then you can see the strengthening in business investment. Okay, next. From an inflation standpoint, we'll get another number this week. The consumer price index in the last 12 months up 1.2%. The core, which excludes food and energy, is up 1.6. The importance of this is that it is still running below the numbers, the target that the Federal Reserve has. The Fed wants to see that core rising at an average of about 2%, and we're running below that, okay? And that's got major implications for policy, as we'll see in a minute. If you look at that chart, you'll notice in March, April, and May, the numbers were down. I point that out because as the spring goes on and we get a year away from those numbers, the year-over-year numbers are going to jump, assuming we had declines in the price level then, and we actually will be having increases this year. So you'll see a pop in the inflation rate. Okay, next. We've seen major changes in monetary policy, which is a big deal, obviously, for insurance companies. The Federal Reserve reacted in March very quickly to the onset of the pandemic, and they cut rates twice. They took the federal funds rate back down to that 0 to 0.25%, where it had been during the Great Recession. They dusted off the playbook. They provided broad liquidity support to markets to make sure they kept on functioning. And they are now buying $120 billion a month in government securities, 80 billion in treasuries, and 40 billion in mortgage-backed securities. The idea there is, again, to keep longer-term rates down to help with that. They're also participating, the Fed, in the PPP program. We've got that rolling out again this week. The Main Street lending program, which was supposed to go away, was renewed. The Fed has purchased over about $3 trillion in securities in the last year. Okay. Every other meeting, the Fed now puts out its expectations for interest rates. Interest rates are expected to remain low until the end of 2023. That's what they say. They have the federal funds rate staying down at the current levels until the end of 2023. Now, obviously, that can change. The Fed in August at the Jackson Hole Conference, Chairman Powell gave a speech and talked about a new Fed operating policy. This is a big deal. In the past, the Fed had had that target of 2% inflation, and they had not achieved it. Inflation has been running below that. The Fed said after periods of below target inflation, they will tolerate periods of above target inflation to keep that average near 2%. Now, you'll remember, starting really in the latter part of 2015, the Fed began to slowly raise rates. Why? Not because inflation was there, but because they expected it to arrive. It did not. Okay. So they've now backed away from that policy. They're going to wait, let inflation run somewhat above target before they react. Okay. Now, what it really means is for a while, lower longer. Well, insurance companies, of course, with reserves, and you hope to earn on those reserves, and it's making life more difficult. On the left-hand side of that slide, just to show you what happened last year. On the first business day of the year, January 2nd, 2020, the 1-year Treasury was at 1.56%. On the last trading day of the year, it was 0.1%. So you get an idea of the magnitude of the decline in short-term rates last year. And of course, we've had mortgage rates below 3%. Next slide. This particular slide, the top half shows the federal funds rate. This is the Fed's target rate, the one that they can directly influence, directly control. You can see they pushed rates up, okay, and then they plummeted last year, okay, now down to that 0 to 0.25%. The bottom slide is the 10-year rate. The 10-year rate, 10-year Treasury, of course, is very important from the standpoint mortgages are priced off of that. Now, if you look at that, you see the declines in the 10-year, but look at the right-hand edge of that. You've seen the 10-year start to rise. On the 11th of this month, the 10-year was at 1.13%. It broke through that 1% level, and it's been moving up as the prospects for more stimulus, more deficit finance have increased with the political changes that we've seen. So that's something we'll have to watch very, very carefully. All right, next slide. Fiscal policy, that's the government's taxing and spending power, okay, reacted very quickly in this particular cycle. We've actually there have been 5 coronavirus bills passed. You remember, the CARES Act gets the most attention as well as the most recent one, but there were others that expanded sick leave, the Families First Act, those sorts of things. But remember what we did. You had stimulus checks, you had extra unemployment compensation, forgivable loans, help to hospitals, states, cities, testing, expanded sick leave, help to gig workers, a plethora of new programs. About $4 trillion in new spending was authorized. Now, in fiscal 2020, the federal deficit hit 3.1 trillion. Spending rose 47% last year, okay? To 6.5 trillion. Revenues actually declined to 3.4 billion, hence your deficit. Federal deficit was 16.1% of GDP. That's the same as it was, or basically higher, the highest since 1945, when you can imagine we had some other stuff going on. Okay. So then recent political theater culminating in the recent tax bill and talk about another round of support. So fiscal policy has responded very, very quickly. Okay, next slide. So here we are, early to mid-January, looking ahead. Will there be another round of stimulus? It's already being discussed. Notice the $2,000 figure that's been bandied about. The last bill was 600. Now we're talking 2,000. That may well happen. We've got vaccine. Number of vaccines out there, ramping up the vaccination programs. Apparently, the vaccine is successful, but there's interesting the production, distribution, acceptance, timing. These are all things that we don't know yet. We've got a new political cast. We didn't know finally what that was going to look like until last week. Okay. Is there another post-holiday surge of infection coming? It appears that there is, as the case counts rise dramatically. In the insurance business, I'm sure your business interruption battles are ongoing in the courts. Okay. You got short-term concerns when you look at what's going on, but long-term excitement, the prospects of the vaccine and returns to a more normal life. Okay. One of the big questions that, as an economist and observer of the environment, is what is the condition of the wounded? Whether we're talking about individuals, businesses, nonprofits, governments, are there zombie firms propped up by PPP loans or deferrals or forbearance? What kind of balance sheet deterioration have we seen? Public companies have to publish the material. Non-public companies obviously do not. Okay, next. Now, I'm thinking people in the insurance business almost by definition think long-term. And I can't help but keep thinking about what's going on in regard to spending, taxes, money supply stuff. We notice in the last year, with all the stuff that's been done, very appropriate, okay, nobody has particularly worried about, well, how do we pay for it? Okay, well, we'll run a deficit. That's fine. Okay. Now, there is a school of thought, modern monetary theory, that says spend what you need to spend in order to achieve your goals. Okay. The United States creates the money that we spend. Okay. I mean, bankruptcy has no meaning. Okay. Lots of worries about the deficit in the past. Think back to your economics class. Okay. What do we worry about? Crowding out private spending, rising interest rates, high inflation, an inability to sell debt. Those things have been around for a long time. But think about the period since the Great Recession. Okay. Those things have not come about. Okay. And there's been a lot of rethinking about the debt deficit. The notion of modern monetary theory is you tighten when you press capacity or when inflation starts to appear. And the debt you don't necessarily worry about because we could grow our way out of it as we did at the end of the Second World War. Okay. Look at the talk of just the last month. Okay. No concerns about how the stuff gets paid for. This becomes cover, and I'm not trying to be political here at all. This becomes cover for anything, whether we're talking about a Green New Deal, defense, infrastructure, healthcare. You spend what you need to spend. All right. Next slide. Now, if you think about this, we've had all this spending. I'll show you later. Consumers have very high level of savings. There's lots of excess reserves in the banking system. We have the possibility of a big surge in spending later this year as the pandemic ends. There is a recent book published within the last couple of months, The Great Demographic Reversal by Goodhart and Pradhan. One of the virtues of being trapped in the house is that you have lots of time, or more time than normal, to read stuff outside the daily. This is, if you get a copy of this book, don't read it before going to bed because you won't be able to sleep. One of their theses is we've had tremendous changes, of course, in the medical system. We've had the exploding healthcare costs, but Alzheimer's and dementia, which are associated with age, where you have people functioning, but still with long life expectancies, we're going to have increasing dependency ratios and dramatic increases in healthcare costs, much of which will come from the public. The global workforce is slowing down. We know it's slowing down here. We know it's slowing down in China. And that has been a factor helping to hold down inflation. That's going away. A lot of the public debt is short term, has to be refinanced. You think about what we just did. Some of you probably got your $600 checks or deposits in your account. We've demonstrated the government can pass out money in a matter of hours, regardless. I mean, not based on need or losses. They just passed it out. Think about the implications of that, or the potential moral hazard, if you like. Okay, next slide. Now, for some of you who might remember the 1970s, okay, if you remember, we used to focus on the money supply, and there was a lot of concern about that in the late 70s, early 80s, the day that came out. Nobody talks much about it. Well, I went back, I went and looked, and I thought this would be fun, and I put the graphs in here so you wouldn't think I was making this stuff up. The top graph is M1, coins, currency, checking accounts, spendable dollars, okay? M2, which is the bottom graph, that includes M1 plus time deposits, money market deposit accounts, savings accounts. Now, look at the bottom. The growth rate of M1 in the year to December 21st was over 65%. M2 was up 24%. Now, maybe that's nothing to worry about, but I think you have to be concerned with, will those kinds of increases in the money supply translate into inflation down the road? Something to watch. We worried about this after the Great Recession, didn't happen. Watch what happens this time. All right, next slide. Let's talk about Oregon, okay? Interesting data coming out, population growth. The Census Bureau has Oregon population up last year at 0.6%. Portland State has 0.7%, okay? But you can see, if you remember, that's a lot slower than we'd seen in the past. It's all, depending on whose numbers, it's roughly double the US average. There was a publication recent about getting into detail about the migration patterns between states. Okay, this is for 2019, the top 50 state-to-state moves. And I thought that was sort of interesting for this group. You know, the largest move was California to Texas, then New York to Florida, California to Arizona. The 8th was California to Oregon. 13th was California to Washington, and 22nd was Oregon to Washington. So that they're in the top tier of state-to-state moves that, you know, that Oregon's involved in. You know, we're no longer at the top of the growth charts. You know, as I showed you, Oregon now at 32nd. Okay. Oregon went into this recession with significant rainy day funds. That's not always been the case for Oregon, for those of you who think back to other cycles. And of course, we had the conflagration summer, which I'm sure made some of your lives very interesting. Okay, next slide. If you look on the right-hand side there, you see monthly changes in payroll employment in Oregon. And if you'll remember, that looks very much like what we saw nationally, with the slight decline in March, the huge decline in April, and the uptick since that point in time. We don't have December yet for Oregon. No, Oregon job change February to April, down 14.5%. The key thing is, look, everything was down. And like the nation, the dramatic decline in leisure and hospitality. Okay. So as I do this in different states, it's really pretty interesting. States look pretty much the same, or many of them do. Next one. You know, then let's look April to November. You know, we came part way back, up 7.8%. The most recent data, November, you can see on the right-hand side from the employment department, you know, all the metro areas in the state have declines in employment, okay? You can see the Portland area down about 9%, 111,000. Declines in Corvallis, Eugene. I mean, broad-based weakness. That's been the nature of this particular downturn. Okay, next slide. Just to show you what happened since February, another way of sort of looking at this to show the month-to-month changes. I went and took the seasonally adjusted employment for Oregon and for Portland. I called February 100, okay? And then I took all the months since that time. Everything's relative to February. And you can see, you know, the slight decline in March, then big decline in April, and then slowly, irregularly coming back. Same thing for Portland, okay? And you can see, obviously, we're not back yet, but the direction, the trend has been up. Okay, next. This is really fun because this is stuff that we haven't been able to do before. One of the things that's happened with the advent of big data and the like is that you can get data. I mean, Oregon obviously doesn't have a sales tax, but there is a project called Track the Recovery, Opportunity Insights. It's been put together, funded by a cooperative effort by Brown University, by Harvard, and by the Gates Foundation. And they use anonymous, you know, debit card, credit card transactions, that sort of thing, to track spending in areas data that we wouldn't necessarily have had. Okay, and if you look at this, we have got. Actually, it's so small on my phone. I've got to get a magnifying glass to see it. But you can see, there it is. Okay, you can see consumer spending. The top line is groceries. Okay. Then we've got total spending, and then we've got restaurants, hotels. On the left-hand side, this is all relative to January. Look at the jump in grocery store sales, okay, that took place early in that March, April time period. In grocery store sales in mid-December, we're still up 37%. Okay. Then you look at total consumer spending in the state, down 4.4, and then look at restaurants and hotels, down 43%. Then on the right-hand side, we've got the same thing for Portland, and you can see the big jump in grocery sales there in up 64, almost 65%. Total spending down 1.6. Restaurants and hotels down 44%. But you get some insights into the movement. There's probably wide ranges of error, but it tracks, it gives us some insights that we did not have before in Oregon. Okay, next slide. And I know you're from all over the state, and they don't do every place, but this is consumer spending. This is through December 6th. And, I put in Malheur County, Lincoln County, okay, and a decline in Jackson County. You can see Jackson was down 6.4, Lincoln was up sharply, Malheur was up sharply. And again, this is relative to January of 2020. Which is the base. Okay, so it depends in part, obviously, on where you are. Okay, next slide. This slide shows changes in employment by wage level. Okay, and the key thing that I want you to see from this is, again, it's from the same source, Track the Recovery. Note the decline in low wage, down 36%. Middle wage down 4.8, high wage down 3.1. Well, if you look at what happened, I showed you the fiscal policy where we had the government send out all this money largely in the second quarter. For example, in the second quarter, personal income in the United States, as the economy was collapsing, okay, you saw an increased personal income rose at almost a 36% annual rate. Why? Wages was going down, or earnings were going down, but transfer payments rose. Look at Oregon. Personal income in Oregon, second quarter, up almost at a 44% annual rate. Wages going down, transfer payments. Same with Washington. So you see the way that fiscal policy offset the weakening in earnings. Okay, next one. This is from the small business census. The Census Bureau has been doing these small business pulse surveys. This is the one that just came out earlier this week, and it compares, how businesses have been affected by the pandemic, in terms of declines in business and the like. And you can see Oregon looks very much like the nation. Okay, next one. Oregon's fiscal situation. Okay, Oregon's fiscal situation this time, we went into the recession with reserves. The expectation is the general fund in fiscal 2019 to 21 down about 3%, cushioned by the reserve. Remember, we have the reserves, and they held up better than a lot of other states because of our reliance on income taxes. And you can see that income actually held up pretty well. And if you look in detail at that slide we just looked at, you can see it supported Oregon income. Then in the third quarter, it started to unwind. Transfers went down, okay, and total personal income fell. but earnings rose. And so now when we get into this next quarter, we'll likely see the earnings will continue to rise, but also we'll very likely see more transfer payments as these are paid out. Portland and Oregon have what the head of the Portland Chamber calls an image issue. Oregon does. The brand has been damaged by the events of the summer. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, particularly for Portland. Okay, next slide. Okay, a little bit on housing. Okay, house prices continue to climb as they are nationally. House prices up about 8.3%. Case-Shiller, this is from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, houses financed by Fannie and Freddie. Case-Shiller, Portland area, they track up 8.9. Very few households in Oregon are underwater or more than the house is worth. Very short, low inventories. This is happening nationally as the demand for housing has increased. And you've got about 185,000 rent adults in households in Oregon that are not caught up on their rent. That's a risk as we go forward with the eviction moratorium. I'll have to see what happens there. Next. The outlook, expectation that the U.S. economy will continue to grow in 2021, or will grow. It didn't grow in 2020, but it will grow in 2021. Growth rate 3.5%, 4.5%, but there's a lot of uncertainty. The recovery is underway, but the trajectory is very, very uncertain. Oregon, too, is expected to return to employment growth of about 4% in 2021 and the most recent consensus. But the course of the virus, the nature of the additional stimulus and the timing, the success of the vaccination program, how people behave. We don't know how behavior has changed. There are upside risks. The vaccine may be get out and rolled out very quickly, efficiently, be accepted, and people respond going back to what regard as more normal behavior. There's a lot of savings, okay? They may turn that into spending. You look at the 1920s or accounts after the Black Plague in the 1340s. When it was over, people responded with happiness and spending. The downside risks, remove more restrictions, premature ending of stimulus, and the damage at this point that we don't know is out there. Next. I think you can argue that this experience has been an accelerant. The pandemic has functioned as an accelerant in the society. Things that were there, but they're happening more rapidly or more extensively. Online shopping, for one. Regional dispersion. We had people, moving out of California, moving out of some urban areas for a long time, responding to lower housing costs outside, lower costs. But now, with this work from home, we've demonstrated the ability to work remotely. This is speeding up, or seems to be. More attention on connectivity and the digital divide. People that don't have access to the internet. Low-income people, kids in low-income homes that don't have the electronics, and then suddenly it's virtual schooling, and you have a problem in remote areas. So this is getting a lot of attention. The spread of digital payments, income distribution issues, heightened by the fact that the poor have borne the brunt of this downturn. The healthcare system, how it functions, insurance tied to employment, those kinds of things getting attention. Vaccine development. Look at the rapidity with which that happened. It wasn't years, it was months. Coping, and that could happen for other diseases as well. And coping with change. How do we cope with the disruption? Okay, next. I keep coming back to disruption, destruction, and creation in thinking about what's going on. The human tragedy, global, poverty increases, questions about the viability of business models. There's long lists of firms in bankruptcy or liquidation. The industrial impacts, travel, tourism, restaurants, aerospace, public transit, the education system have all been hit very, very hard. By the same token, grocery stores have boomed, bike shops, RV dealers, production and distribution of cleaning products, what we're doing this morning, home remodeling, pet shops, Amazon, plexiglass, distribution. I mean, new ways replace old. It's Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. It goes on all the time. But what we're seeing now is incredible rapidity. And then the challenge, okay, of facilitating the changes, the public policy challenge. A lot of those jobs that have disappeared are not going to come back. Okay. How do you help people transition? Okay, next. How will this change us in the roles that we play in the system? Savings behavior. Savings behavior back in January as a percentage of disposable income was 7.6%. Okay. In April, it was 33.7. You had all this money coming in, stimulus, extra unemployment. You couldn't spend it. Savings rate soared. Then it tapered off. November down to 12.9. Probably going to pop up again with the recent stimulus. But remember, that's raw material for spending. Okay. Or will people continue to save at a higher level as they did after the Great Depression and the Great Recession? How long is it going to take us to emerge from this trauma, to go out to movies, crowds, to be comfortable making trips? Look at how your own patterns have changed. What habits will persist? I've been trapped in the house since March, okay? We used to go out to eat a lot. Now I'm discovering the joys of we're eating at home. Will that change? To how often or how will we go back? Will we go back to conferences? I mean, this is probably easier than finding a place at the Mac Club to park. Time around the house, the remodels. You got to add a room in case the kids have to use that as a school or your home office that you now work at for 6 months a year. Supply chain importance, focus on that. This remote work. How much will we go back to the office? How much will remain remote? Is it a blip or is it a lasting trend? Okay. The geographic implications, suburban, smaller cities, milder climates so you can eat outside. Relationships as we spend more time stuck at home. The independence of the Federal Reserve, the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. They're working together. When it comes to a time they're not on the same page, what's going to happen? Next. Okay. Whoops. The long shadow and leftovers of this. Plans disrupted, assumptions changed. What's the worst thing if you're starting a business? What's the worst thing that can happen? Or if you're in a business, maybe the worst thing was, oh, no growth in sales. But you probably didn't have in there the government ordering you to shut down and zero sales. Risks have increased. The long shadow, who's going to survive in this world of deferrals, forbearance, eviction moratoriums? The education disruption, lifetime implications. And again, it's impacted the poor primarily, declining college enrollments and attendance. What are the long-term implications of that? People dropping out of the labor force to take care of kids, for example, stay at home because they're afraid or because of underlying health conditions. That's income and experience loss. People drop out, okay, drop out early. That holds down the US labor force growth, okay. Retirement resources being used early or not being able to be accumulated. The long-term damage from COVID, renal, pulmonary damage, cardiac damage. In Oregon, yeah, we went through the current biennium in reasonably good shape. Next biennium, expected to have revenues up or funds up 5%. That's not enough for a continuing service budget. So you got problems there. Last one. The safety net fissures, okay, highlighted by the pandemic, sick leave, insurance tied to employment, essential low-wage workers. How will those be addressed? Will fiscal policy change as we approach capacity limits and inflation accelerates? The trade conflicts. A year ago, we were worried about trade conflicts. They've been overshadowed. They're not gone. Okay. What role is the US in a multipolar world? The COVAX, the World Vaccination Program, that we have been not significant players. WTO, WHO, the UN, Paris Accord, Trans-Pacific Partnership without the United States. It's important to Oregon with our international connections. And I like to say the way we were is not the way we are. And I would end with asking people to stay safe. And if we have a minute or two, I will share sort of the current version of my outlook poem for the year and try to summarize the presentation. 2020 opened with the 12th year in sight. Inflation was still low and labor markets remained tight. The Fed had cut rates and the inversion was a goner. Prospects were good that this upturn could run years longer. Then from wet markets in Wuhan, COVID-19 did appear. Our connected world meant that problems there were soon here. 1918, SARS, Ebola, and plagues from the past entered our media torrent quite fast. Kirkland, New York City were hotspots. Others came across the nation. Governors and mayors responded with a crescendo of rules, closures, and regulations. A policy-induced recession appeared very fast. A February peak, said the referees. Q2 GDP fell at a 31% pace. April's job decline erased a decade's hiring spree. Fed policymakers responded with speed and memories of the last episode. The funds rate went back to zero, and in with liquidity they rode. Fiscal policy reacted at a rarely seen pace. Checks and electrons covered the land like a morning dew. Forgivable loans, extra unemployment, manna for governments, airlines, hospitals, and the self-employed too. The May job count started up and the long climb continues from a very deep hole. An income cushion was provided for a while to keep firms and people whole. Partisan bickering in the election were the next round's temporary demise. This came even as new cases continued to rise. Retail housing and travel upticks signaled that the rebound was on track. The trauma left some names in Chapter 11, and many locations would not be back. Airlines and hotels have seen demand disappear and employment come a cropper, while Amazon, Zoom, bike shops, grocers, and takeout do prosper. We're not the same place that we were earlier this year. The virus remains something to fear. Things are being done differently in nearly all aspects of our lives. Zooming, masking, distancing, and working in plexiglass hives. We're in the storm. We're in the storm together, but the experiences have varied. Low-income families and workers have been hit, their recent progress parried. No sick leave, little savings, insurance tied to employment are a recipe for disaster. The society will be challenged to alter the safety net much faster. A long grinding upturn is the most likely course as the year draws upon us. Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca have vaccines to quell fear. People's behavior in all their decision-making roles is the great unknown. Consumers, investors, parents, policymakers, and entrepreneurs for the businesses they own. The nation's been challenged many times before, from Pearl to 9/11 and economic contractions. We learn change and adjust, and there are policy reactions. Our resilience is again being tested in a pandemic shock reminiscent of old. Hopefully we'll emerge stronger and fairer with policy moves quite bold. The election is over. President Biden got the job, although those on the other side continue to sob. Vaccinations are upon us that are laden with hope, a prerequisite for our fear to subside and activity to stoke. All 50 states dropped without exception. The oil patch weakened, travel saw a giant correction. Fear, childcare, and school closures shrank the labor force, reducing at least short-term the nation's growth course. The Northwest boom faltered when the downturn arrived. The MAC civil turmoil and fires threatened areas that once thrived. The recovery has started with the region on the rise, but that must not blind us to the victims of nature's surprise. Thanks for your attention.
John, thank you very, very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it despite all of the trouble. We wish you and Carol the best as you find power again there in Coeur d'Alene. And thanks for not letting lack of power stop you from joining us today. For the rest of you, we'd like to thank the Premier Partners again and remind you that today is a fundraiser for Make-A-Wish. Please text Big I OR to 44321. Again, that's Big I OR to 44321. We'd also like to remind you of item number 3 on the virtual triple threat for this week on our virtual triple threat. It's the E&O course. The E&O course for tomorrow, if anyone needs E&O credit, we have the Oregon CE available in 2 different E&O courses tomorrow with Zoom from Richard Lund of Swiss Re, Shirley Zielinski, our underwriter, Chris Boggs from the Virtual University, and Jim Callahan, the legal counsel with Callahan and Shears. The information's on the website, or you can contact Tira or Leanne if you'd like to register. Both of those courses count towards your E&O discount if you're buying your E&O coverage through the Big I. Our goal today was to raise another $1,000 for the Make-A-Wish Foundation during our presentation, and we are $50 away from that goal. So again, the reminder, text Big I Oregon or Big I OR to 44321. Thank you all for joining us today. Be safe, stay well.